Hi, I'm Professor Julie Posetti. I am Chair of the Centre for Journalism and Democracy at City University of London. I'm also Director of the Information Integrity Initiative at TheNerve, which is a digital forensics lab established by the Nobel laureate Maria Ressa. And today I'm going to be presenting new research, which I will share the context for, the global context. And this research is focused on the experiences of women human rights defenders, women activists, women political actors, and women journalists, that is, women in public life, with gender-based online violence. And I first want to set the scene. So, in the age of the Broligarchs, women in public life are subjected to increasingly sophisticated online violence, from viral acts of nudification to AI-assisted synthetic rape, which is designed to humiliate them into silence and steal their agency. History shows that when authoritarian power consolidates, women who speak truth to power, male power in particular, from journalists to politicians, are always among the first to be publicly abused, discredited, and pushed out of public life by those in power. And today, the authoritarian playbook is being propped up by digital infrastructures that are owned and controlled by a small and unelected class of tech billionaires, many of whom have traded user safety and privacy for obscene profits and proximity to increasingly authoritarian power. In turn, the broligarchical fusion of ultra-wealthy tech bros with political oligarchs who are flirting with fascism has allowed the strategic use of online violence against women in public life to be digitized, automated, and deployed at unprecedented scale and speed. This supercharging of online violence represents an escalating threat to women's participation in public life and democratic deliberation, especially in the context of increased repression of women's rights organisations and networked misogyny. It's designed to stymie women's freedom of expression, and it's part of a burgeoning strategy to roll back their hard-won rights to gender equality. We're at a tipping point. And today I want to speak about new research that I led for UN Women, which offers a disturbing insight into the ways online violence manifests itself in the AI age, and it reveals the severity of its impacts on survivors, with evidence of alarming rates of mental health diagnosis and self-censorship. So let me walk you through this data. As I said, this is for a study which was commissioned by UN Women with the support of the European Union. Just to give you some background for the research that I'm going to share with you today, it's good to understand that this evolved from a study commissioned by UNESCO, which was iteratively published between 2019 and 2022, which I led with a team of international researchers. And it was focused exclusively on the experiences of women journalists. We surveyed over 700 women journalists around the world. We interviewed around 180 women journalists and those who work with them and who are responsible for their well-being, lawyers, editors, for example, civil society organizations. We also conducted 15 in-depth case studies at a country level, really diverse selection of countries. And we studied over 2.5 million social media posts that were directed at women we consider to be emblematic cases for the experience of gender-based online violence. They were Maria Ressa, who I now work for. Before she was the Nobel laureate, she was the subject of one of these big data case studies, having experienced really horrific gender-based online violence in connection with what we term lawfare, so targeted attacks that were designed to falsely criminalize her conduct when she was the editor-in-chief of an organization called Rappler. And we tracked and traced the escalation of these threats from online to offline harm. The other case was the celebrated British investigative journalist Carol Cadwalader, who had exposed the Cambridge Analytica scandal and was targeted in the context of her work on Brexit as well as on big tech accountability. So that's the foundation for what came next. And the survey that we ran for the chilling, as those studies were published under the banner of the UNESCO, was conducted at the end of 2020. Exactly 5 years later, we surveyed an overlapping group of women journalists alongside women human rights defenders, activists, women political actors, and women public communicators of other kinds. So that would include influencers, writers, and other such actors who have a public profile associated with their work. And in 2025, at the end of 2025, exactly 5 years later, we surveyed 640 women from 119 countries. And it's important to note that we are able to compare the data for the women journalists from 2020 with the data from the women journalists surveyed in 2025. But with the other groups of women, this is the original fresh data which we first recorded in 2025. So we can't be comparative when it comes to the women in those other groups. But let me walk you through some of highlights, I was going to say, some of the lowlights, rather, from this data. So we see that overall, around 70% of the women we surveyed had experienced online violence in the course of their work. Now, when we look at the group of women journalists there, you can see that 75% of that group had experienced online violence in the context of their jobs. Now, that figure in 2020 was 73%. So it's increased marginally, but what we can deduce is that this is a pretty consistent level of exposure to gender-based online violence in the course of doing work as a journalist, as a woman journalist in particular. And we can see the figures are pretty consistent for the other groups of women. Another really important aspect of this work is being able to connect the women's experience of online violence with the offline abuse, attacks, and harassment that they experience. So we're talking here about the continuum of violence against women, the trajectory of online violence to offline harm. And those of you who followed this issue for some time might appreciate frustration, ongoing frustration, with dismissive claims like, it's just digital violence, it's just online, it's not real. Get offline, just mute, delete, report. That's not possible when your work requires you to exist in digital spaces. It's not possible when you need to curate communities, when you need to interact with constituencies, and when you need to reach audiences. And so it's vital that we understand that there is nothing virtual about online violence. It causes real physical harm, and it certainly, as I'll show you, causes psychological injury. Now, what we can see from the data that you're looking at now is that 40%, 41% rather, if we round up, of the women we surveyed had experienced offline harm that they believe was triggered online as part of the campaign of online abuse, harassment, and attacks that they were experiencing. We see the figures pretty consistently across the groups, 44.5% roughly of writers and other public communicators, 44% of human rights defenders and activists, and 42% of journalists and media workers saying that they had experienced this. Now, to think about this comparatively, which again is really important and instructive, let's look at the data when we compare the women journalists who responded to the survey in 2020 with the women journalists who responded to the UN Women's Survey in 2025. In 2020, we can see that 20%, so 1/5 of the women journalists said they'd experienced this offline harm, which they connected directly to the online violence that they were experiencing. Now, we identified through those respondents examples like being physically attacked, having their property vandalized, having pets killed, would you believe, being screamed at in shopping centres, with reference to abuse and memes that had surfaced online. In one case, a journalist who had her name graffitied next to the sights of a gun on a wall in Belfast. Many more examples like this. So in 2020, we saw 20% of the women journalists saying they'd experienced this trajectory from online harm to offline harm. Fast forward to 2025, and we see that figure has more than doubled to 42% of women journalists. That is a really staggering and hopefully motivating statistic. Motivating in the sense that this crisis is deepening and worsening, that those who are being targeted are clearly at greater risk of offline harm connected to the online violence they are experiencing. The other important data coming out of this UN Women's Survey, which we are continuing to publish from over the course of the next 9 months or so, is the connection between generative AI, which really was mainstreamed at the end of 2022. So it's a relatively new phenomenon, although AI itself is, of course, not new technology. But this concept of generative AI that really allows for much easier, much quicker, much cheaper production of abuse-oriented content, including, for example, deep fakes and nudification, as it's referred to. But it also allows for the much quicker distribution, in some cases, seamless distribution of this content when it's created to large-scale audiences via the algorithmic drivers of social media platforms. So we asked our respondents whether they had experienced online violence that they identified as having been assisted by artificial intelligence technologies. And you can see there that roughly a quarter, 24%, said that they had indeed experienced online violence, which was AI assisted. Now, that is really important to understand that at the end of 2025, just as the nudification crisis, if I can refer to it as that, was occurring, where we saw the seamless integration of content that had been prompted, for example, using Grok, which is the AI chatbot created by Elon Musk, and the seamless integration of that content with X, the platform that he also owns. What we saw in that context was the rapid fire distribution of content that was designed to shame, to humiliate, and frankly, to expose women to increased harm. And that phenomenon has triggered a range of responses from states with legislative and regulatory maneuvers designed to try and prevent the large-scale creation and distribution of that sort of content, which allows for, just increasingly believable material, which undresses women, which allows women to be posed, which allows for fake rape videos to be passed off as accurate using the real images of women that have been altered and modified. One of the most horrific examples of this that I've seen in the course of this work for UN Women was actually a UK MP who was campaigning for a ban on these nudification apps. And she found herself being depicted in a synthetic rape video, in a deep fake video, being chloroformed and prepared for rape by groups of men who were distributing this content, who were countering or attempting to counter her work to ensure accountability for the creators of this technology and the perpetrators of these videos. Really awful stuff. And if we look into the data with a little more detail, we can see that 12% of the women who responded to our survey across the groups had experienced non-consensual sharing of personal images, including those of a sexual or intimate nature. 6% had been targeted through deepfakes or manipulated video or images, and 27% had been targeted with unsolicited sexual advances via direct or private messages, including unwanted intimate images and cyber flashing. There is also a really taxing cost faced by women who are subjected to gender-based online violence. And that is the cost of expression being minimized, the cost associated with efforts to silence, diminish, and ultimately disappear women from public life, which is a feature of online violence campaigns. We called the studies we published for UNESCO the chilling because of the chilling effect on freedom of expression and gender equality that this phenomenon posed. And so self-censorship as a response to online violence that is perpetrated with impunity and facilitated by companies that effectively allow this impunity to flourish is causing women to censor themselves, is causing them to withdraw from social media. So we see here, for example, that self-censorship on social media stands at the rate of over 45% for women journalists, jumping up to 50% for writers and other public communicators. And when it comes to self-censoring at work, that statistic ranges from around a fifth to a quarter of the women who participated. Really devastatingly, there's been a 50% increase in women journalists and media workers who've reported self-censoring as a response to gender-based online violence between 2020 and 2025. That is a huge cost. It's a huge cost, not just for women journalists, but also for their audiences, for news organizations that seek to reflect societies in all of their diversities. It's also a cost to gender equality more broadly, from everything we know from media studies about the importance of having women tell the stories that they cover from a female perspective, and especially when it comes to covering issues connected to gender identity and gender equality. This is a bigger problem because what it shows is actually that women are still being required to be the first responders and to do their own triage when it comes to experiencing gender-based online violence. So they're both the primary targets of this form of violence and also expected to be the first responders to the problem. We can no longer stand by and suggest that the management of this crisis be outsourced to the women themselves, the women who are targeted. Another really important aspect to consider here is the impact on mental health for women in public life when they're exposed to this kind of violence. We see here from our 2025 data, a quarter of the women we surveyed saying that they had experienced or been diagnosed with actually anxiety or depression. And nearly 13% had been diagnosed with or treated for PTSD directly connected to their experience of gender-based online violence. And when we break that down into the different categories of women in public life, we can see that it rises from a quarter in the case of women journalists right up to nearly 40%, 4 in 10 women writers and other public communicators. That's specifically with reference to anxiety and depression. And we can see the similar breakdown represented with regard to diagnosis and treatment for PTSD. So this is a very real crisis in health. It's also a workplace safety issue, and it should be understood in that context. For women journalists, for example, under international human rights law, because of the protections provided by Article 19, which is used to ensure that journalism can be practiced freely and safely, both online and offline, we have an obligation to ensure that women journalists and others who are public communicators in the public interest can do their work wherever it's required to be done. And at the moment, clearly, it is not safe. It should be much safer to do this kind of work in digital spaces. The other area that we have released data on is pathways to redress from a law enforcement and legal remedy perspective. So we can see that 25% of women had reported online violence incidents to the police, while 15% overall had initiated legal action in an effort to seek justice. However, we had a response to our question about their experience of reporting to the police, and around a quarter of the women we surveyed said that they had experienced treatment that they understood to be victim blaming. So we still see this as a dominant theme in responses to attempts to manage or deal with gender-based online violence. Things that are themes rather that are familiar to anyone who's worked in gender violence. Victim blaming, slut shaming, what did you do to trigger this? That kind of scenario. And we've seen an increase also in the number of women journalists and media workers who have reported online violence to the police. In fact, it's almost doubled since 2020. That figure now, as I said, is around 22.5%. Which could indicate an increase in incidents. It could also indicate an increase in awareness of the problem, or a frustration with the failure of big tech companies, for example, to stem the tide of abuse on their platforms, and so an increased willingness to go to the police. We see a similar increase when it comes to women journalists referring their cases to lawyers, trying to initiate legal action to get some kind of remedy. So compared to 2020, we see in 2025 that 13.6% of women journalists had experienced or had rather initiated legal action. So what do we do about all this? We will be publishing a series of recommendations associated with a comprehensive report that will analyse not just the statistics, but the contributions that the women we surveyed made about their experiences. And that will include a long list of specific recommendations for action. But two that are immediately important are that there is a need to develop tools to better identify, monitor, report, and repel AI-assisted online violence. And secondly, there is a need to enforce, and I mean enforce, and the political will required to do that, legal and regulatory mechanisms that are designed to require big tech companies to prevent their technologies being deployed against women in the public sphere in the ways that undermine their rights to gender equality, democratic participation, and freedom of expression. And that's where I'm going to leave the presentation for today. But I just want to add that if you have experienced gender-based online violence, you're not alone. As you can see from the data that I've shared, so very many women, particularly women in public life whose job it is to speak truth to male power, have experienced online violence in the course of their work. Please don't stay silent. Please talk to people who you work with, colleagues, bosses, civil society organisations that are there to support you. Go to the police if you feel it's safe to do so, particularly if the risk has recently escalated, if the risks include threats of physical or sexual violence. Again, this is not something that you have to bear alone, and it is not something that you should feel that you have to stay silent about. We have to actually work to end this scourge in the interests of gender equality, democracy, and freedom of expression.